All right, so this is a Unit 3 populations review covering Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. You can see that it is covering all of Chapter 5, Section 1, 2, and 3. And then in Chapter 6, the sections of the book is 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, and then just page 1 of 6.4. All right, so talking about ecologists and how they study populations, they look at 5 things. The first thing to look at is geographical range. So the area that the population is inhabiting. So how big is that area? They also look at population density. So they look at in the area how many individuals are in that area. So there's a number per area there of the number of individuals. They look at age structure. So they look at how many and how old the population of organisms are. They look at how fast the population is growing, so they look at growth rate, and then they look at how the population is distributed in the area they live. So whether they are uniformed in layout, random, or clumped in in how they are dispersed in their area. So when we think about organisms and populations changing, sometimes they change because they either emigrate out, which means exit, or they immigrate in and come into a new ecosystem. And so that can also affect population size. When we look at population size or population growth, there are these 2 types of graphs. There's a logistic graph and an exponential curve graph. So this exponential curve graph, if you look over here with the elephants, this is an exponential graph. Another name for exponential graph is a J-curve graph, because you can see it kind of looks like the shape of a J. And what we're seeing is a rapid growth, and it continues to rapidly grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. It does not stop. However, there has to be a point where some factors come into play, and so that's when you look at the logistic growth. And another name for logistic growth is an S-curve shape. So let's look at this logistic growth graph a little bit more. There is a part where it is exponentially growing, and then it begins to slow down, so it begins to curve, and the growth is starting to slow in the population, and then it kind of stabilizes and then remains kind of in this number from now on. And that right here means that the population has reached its carrying capacity, which means the population is stable and the environment cannot support any more of them. That is the max number it can get, and it just kind of stays in that kind of number. So what can determine carrying capacity? Well, there's 2 types of limiting factors. There's density dependent limiting factors, and there's density independent limiting factors. So I'm going to do dependent first. So dependent is how dense the population is. So is the population really high in numbers, and are they super, super dense like you see in these pictures with the penguins? And so here are the examples of density dependent. There's competition will increase when you're super dense. Predation will increase when you're super dense. Herbivory can be affected by the plants when you're super dense. Parasitism can spread quickly when you're super dense. The disease can spread really quickly in a population when you're super dense. And stress from overcrowding for being so dense and having no space to live. These 6 are examples of density dependent limiting factors. Density independent limiting factors means that you don't have to be dense to be affected by these factors. In fact, they infect all populations, no matter how big or small they are. And examples is a natural disaster like forest fires and floods and hurricanes, and unusual weather like a big drought or a super, super crazy cold blizzard that comes through. All organisms, no matter the size of the population, will be affected by that. And those 2 can affect how a population grows. All right. So then moving into chapter 5.3, we look at human population, and you can see based off of this graph that the human population is growing exponentially and it has not stopped. So no carrying capacity and no limiting factors have stopped our population from growing. It is still constantly growing. And so if you have scientists study human populations, it's called demography, and demo is a root word you need to know that means human. And so it's basically the study of human populations. And so we look at birth rates of a population, the death rates we have, and then the age structure to predict kind of the patterns and growths of our different countries. And so here's a picture of 2 age structure graphs. One is the United States, one is Guatemala. The red is males and the yellow is females. And then the numbers represents how old they are and how many of them are in that population at that age, at that moment in time. So you can make predictions. For example, the United States is probably going to stay pretty stable and do a very slow growth because you have a lot in the younger that match the older who are reproducing. So you shouldn't see a huge drastic change in population. But if you look at Guatemala, you have a lot of young children. And so when they get to be in their 20s and 30s, there'll be a whole lot more of them, which means that they'll probably produce a lot more children. So you should see a rapid growth over the next 30 years in Guatemala. All right, in chapter 6, it talks about humans and how we affect our environments. And so we have development and industry and agriculture, which has all been really great, but there's going to be some negativities. And so let's talk about agriculture first. Agriculture, one example that we have provided in our culture is we have monoculture. Remember, mono is a root word that means one. And so monoculture is clearing of land in a large area to only harvest one crop at a time. And so there can be some pros and cons to that. Some pros for us is that it gives us a higher yield, so we get lots of food and efficient productivity. So we have one type of seed and we have one type of tool. We need to grow the seed, and then we have one type of tool to get it out. So it's very, very efficient and gives us a lot of product in an efficient way. The cons is that when you only have one crop in one area, it can deplete the nutrients of the soil, and the depletion of the nutrients can then make us want to add more nutrients to the ground. And so we put fertilizers on our farms, and remember from last unit that adding fertilizers can lead to that eutrophication process, that process where too much fertilizers can run off into our large bodies of water, and then you can have a huge algal bloom that creates a disruption in that ecosystem. So development is also something that is really important, and so we need resources in order to develop our countries. And so we have two different types of resources. We have non-renewable resources and we have renewable. Remember that non-renewable means that it's can be replaced, but not in our lifetime. It takes millions and millions and millions of years to get it back. So coal, oil, gas, those kinds of things. But there are some renewable resources that we are trying to use to get the same type of energy. That would be solar and wind and water and trees to be able to still develop, but use resources that we can see grow back in our lifetime. So we try to live sustainably in our environment. So there's something called sustainable development, which means we try to still get our human needs met, but preserving the environment at the same time. So here are some pictures and examples of recycling, using reusable water bottles and reusable bags when you're shopping, using eco-friendly cleaning supplies so that when they get into the water supply, they don't harm the environment. But we're still getting the needs that we want. So we look at ecological footprint when we look at sustainable development and look at kind of what is your footprint on the biosphere and how much of the energy are you using in the world, how much carbon are you kind of emitting out into the world based off the cars you drive and the transportation you use, and how are you using the trees and food and waste, just kind of looking at how you are imprinting on the world. So last couple of things in chapter 6 can be impacting our world, which would be deforestation and desertification. So they both start with D. That is a root word you need to know that means remove. So deforestation is the removal of forests. It's the loss of trees by cutting them down to use for resources. And then deforestation is basically the removal of nutrients, where there is so much overgrowing farming and agriculture with also droughts that it becomes a desert. And so there is you can't use the dirt. It's just a desert, a dry desert space, and you can't use much of that resource anymore. So we have an industry that can cause water and air pollution, and the two types that we looked at was acid rain and eutrophication. So acid rain was an example of air pollution, because we burn fossil fuels and release sulfur and nitrogen out into the air that mixes with water vapor, and that can lead to drift and fall onto farms and small towns and forests, and that can affect the producers in that ecosystem. Eutrophication, like I said earlier, was just the overuse of fertilizers. That would be an example of water pollution, where you have the fertilizers running off into bodies of water, and huge algal bloom comes from all the nitrogen in the water, and then that kills a lot of the fish. All right, so looking at chapter 6.3 is something called biodiversity. And biodiversity is all the variety of many differences that we have on this earth. And there are three types of biodiversity we look at. There's species diversity, so noticing that we have over 1 million variety of different kinds of species that exist in our world. We have genetic diversity, so looking at just one species, like looking at humans or frogs, we all vary genetically because we have different genetics and genes. Lastly is ecosystem diversity because we all have different types of ecosystems that we live. The type of forest that's in Minnesota would be a different forest in California, and a rainforest is different than a tundra. So those we have different parts of biodiversity. Now, we need to value and benefit biodiversity because it provides us with lots of different varieties of food and agriculture. It provides us with different medicines. It provides us with different resources to build, and it provides us with research and education of just the variety of different species that exist out there. Now, there are threats to biodiversity, and here are the list. The most important ones would be probably pollution and desert deforestation, and then the last one would be invasive species. So invasive species means that we have a species that's not native to the environment. It's not supposed to be there, and it kind of crowds out all the other species that are there because it doesn't have really any predators at that space, and then that can really disrupt the ecosystem and cause a lot of the other native species to get stressed and die. Okay, so that was the review of chapter 5 and 6 for the Unit 3 population test.